So I think we can start now. Yeah, if the rest will also join in as we continue. So welcome everyone. Hi, Dr. Arshnee, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am.
Yes, we can start so that we don't take so long because we know it's quite late on your end too because you're here in Kenya. Yeah, so maybe are you able to share your screen? Can maybe try and share as we
Sure,
start
give
off?
me a second.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee. So hello everyone, it's pleasure having you again today in this session, and really privileged to have Dr. Arshnee with us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee, for joining today's session. It's a great pleasure to have you here. You know, you have so many things going on your end. Yeah, so I'll just love to introduce about the AMR Ambassadors Program. So this is just a Friends program. We currently have around 140 students from different countries in Africa. And the unique thing about this program is that we were focusing mostly on a multidisciplinary approach. So we have so many students who are not from the health sciences, engineering, arts, and the rest. And we are trying to see how we can also incorporate them in the fight against AMR and how we can also leverage on their expertise and bring them in the journey too. So thank you everyone for joining. And just to introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Arshnee Moodley. So she's the CGIAR AMR Hub Lead, and she's also the AMR team lead at International Livestock Research Institute. And the CGIAR AMR Hub was launched in 2019, and the aim was to support efforts to mitigate the risk of agricultural associated AMR in low and middle income countries, working within a One Health framework. Dr. Arshnee is also a microbiologist, and she has a PhD in AMR and zoonosis from the University of Copenhagen. And she joined in ILRI from the Department of Veterinary and Animal Sciences at the same university where she had been an associate professor in AMR. Yeah, AMR, and she had also been an AMR research group leader and the head of the PhD graduate program, molecular biotechnology and infection, and responsible for the NGS services at the section. So you can see Dr. Arshnee really has a lot of experience in AMR. And one thing I love about her presentations, I think she doesn't know this, but I love her critical approach and practical approach to, to all these issues and trying to look at them as they are and trying to offer, practical solutions. This is something that I have learned from the presentations that I've seen, Dr. Arshnee. So thank you so much. And welcome to the session. I will be moderating the session with my co-coordinator for the program, Anastasia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for those lovely words. I thought, can you confirm that you see which display of, because I have two displays. Do you see one slide or two slides?
We currently can see two slides. If you can.
Okay, let me swap displays.
Okay. Yeah, it's now visible. One slide.
Yeah. Perfect. Excellent. So I'm really happy to be here to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I got to where I am, but also about a subject that you've heard now many times when you describe my work. I've been working on this for almost 20 years. So a little bit about myself. I was born in South Africa, grew up in South Africa, and when I was making the slides for this, I thought it would be nice to know about how do you get to be where I am and what was the path for myself. So I grew up in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And I remember when I was very little, there were not many role models around. All my cousins who were older than me, they were either choosing to become a doctor or a lawyer. And I already knew back then that that was not something that I wanted for myself. I wanted something else, but I didn't really know what that other thing was. And really, career discussions about being anything other than a doctor and a lawyer was not very much discussed in my house. In fact, my father did not finish high school, and my mother she started at university, but had to drop out because she was pregnant with me when she was 18. So it's been a bit of an interesting journey for myself. And when I went to high school, still not very clear what I wanted to be when I grew up. But the focus was very much on trying to, do the best I could, get the highest marks I could possibly get. And then suddenly I was seeing myself, entering university, and then it was which university I should go to and what should I study. And again, not really having anybody to talk to about what were my options and what did the impact of those options or those choices I was making as an 18-year-old would mean for the rest of my life. And so just based on a flip of a coin, essentially, because it was based on the fact that the highest mark I got when I graduated from high school was in biology. So that was then what I thought, oh, I should do that because I was so good at it at school. That's what I should study, at least when I got to university. So I ended up choosing a science line and did biochemistry, microbiology, and genetics. Still not very clear what those subjects would mean in terms of a career, in terms of something that I would be able to earn money from. But as an academic, continued. My friends were doing something called medical biochemistry at the time. It was actually called molecular hematology, if I remember correctly. And that sounded like really nice. It was a very elite program, very difficult to get in. You had to get high marks, and thought, well, I like the channel. And so started, got into that, applied and got into that program and studied nothing related to resistance. It was actually about lipoproteins and cholesterol and people who die from myocardial infarctions. And then I finished that, and then it was like, okay, what's the next degree and what's the next path? And so I decided, the next thing was an MSc. And at the time, I was super curious about forensic medicine, and it was just around the corner from where my lab was that I was doing my medical biochemistry degree. And I had seen the professor there, and I'd actually seen him on TV because he was involved in a couple of court cases as a forensics person. And I was quite interested. So when I approached him, he was super happy. He says he doesn't get a lot of students coming his way, but as part of my, if I wanted to work with him, I needed to be able to go to autopsies. And so for a month, I would be visiting on the weekends autopsies in and around Johannesburg, which was not very good on the weekends because they were the most busiest time. And so had to sit in as a fresh, early 20-year-old person, go watch autopsies being done. But unfortunately, when the time came that I had to choose to enroll in the program, he was called into a very big case. And then I was stuck. I didn't have anything to do. Right next door to his office was clinical microbiology, and a professor that I'd never met before, but just kind of stuck my head in. And basically ended up doing an MSc in antimicrobial resistance. And it was totally by accident that I got there. And from an MSc, I knew I wanted to do a PhD, and I knew I wanted to do a PhD abroad. I wasn't quite clear on the subject area as well already back then. But I had applied to universities in the UK and in the US, in Germany. I think it was just one in Germany, in Hanover, and I applied to Denmark. And that's where I ended up going. So in 2005, hopped on a plane as a 25-year-old, and I flew to Denmark to start a PhD. And that man that's standing in the picture next to me was my PhD supervisor. His name is Luca Guardabassi. And together we started working on AMR, and he was starting up a new research group. He had just turned 40 at the time. And so was very young and looking to expand. And it was, AMR was already big in Denmark, but it was getting bigger in Europe as the ban of growth promoters was just coming into effect. And so spent what was supposed to be a 6-year journey in Denmark ended up being, well, I still live in Denmark, actually. I'm on a sabbatical leave here in Kenya. But nonetheless, as a microbiologist, that means, looking in a microscope, plates, but also doing a lot of whole genome sequencing. And so that has really been my career. After about 14 years at the University of Copenhagen, PhD, postdoc, assistant professor, associate professor. Before, I think I was an associate professor by 33. I got a little tired of that. And these are just that's my PhD thesis on the left. And then my postdoc was in an EU project. And then I was looking for a new challenge because Denmark was really at the forefront of antimicrobial resistance. We were talking a lot about how do we change the production sector, how do we change companion animals, getting involved in European projects and trying to look at, how do you manage AMR in a European context. But I was starting to get a little bit tired of that. And an opportunity came where I could join ILRI. They had just launched this CGI AMR hub and was looking for a leader for that. And to be honest, I didn't really think I would get it, but applied nonetheless as a, if you don't buy a ticket, you'll never win the lottery. And so was super surprised when I was called for an interview and then was given the job. My family, we moved to Kenya at the late 2019, and really it was to take control of this hub, which is what I call a platform. And it's a platform to convene the research that we do within the CGIAR that is on antimicrobial resistance. And we also coordinate that research as much as possible. Because as Daniel was saying, AMR is this incredibly complex a problem that requires so many different people and stakeholders to come together. And in the CG, as we're an agricultural organization, global organization, it's about AMR becomes that perfect problem to kind of bring us all together. So this is how we are, the different partners at the CG overlap with each other. We cover livestock, aquaculture, wildlife, human health, policy, the environment, all very, very nice. So I think we're perfectly positioned to address AMR, at least on the agricultural side, very strong on the agriculture, but together with the human health partners can also then bring it all together. We have a number of projects as the hub in East Africa, West Africa, South and Southeast Asia. But then you must be wondering, what is the CGIAR if you've not heard of that before? So this was a grassroots organization that started in the 60s as a way of how do we improve poverty in the global South through agriculture. It is 15 research centers, which are shown here, with a presence in more than 100 countries, and with 50 years of research of doing agricultural research in low and middle income countries. It's based on agriculture, and each institute has its own commodity. I work at ILRI, so it's livestock, World Fish, who have a headquarters in Penang, Malaysia. That's fish. CIMMYT is maize, rice, potatoes, things like that. And the mission is about solving hunger, and to expand that was the original mission, but that over the years had to be expanded because the world changed and how we viewed the world changed. And so it's about food systems. How do we utilize our land and water systems, especially now when we're thinking about the climate crisis? One of the things that I like to talk about when I go out is that, especially when it comes to AMR, is about firstly looking at where is food being produced. And I think that this is very, very important, and who produces the food for whom. So in low and middle income countries, and if you look at the African continent, you could see what proportion of food that is produced by smallholder farmers. And these smallholder farmers, at least in Africa, produce 72% of the food, and this food is consumed locally. And when you start looking at that, and not necessarily for export, you then look at what are the incentives for change in the system. And this is not just a small commodity, a small sector. It is huge, and it contributes billions of dollars worth of food for the continent. But what is also interesting, or perhaps what is also typified by the system in low and middle income countries, is that food is sold locally and it's sold informally. And those two words, I think, is very, very important, and that we need to think about when we think about how do we manage diseases as well as AMR in our context. So this is ILRI. ILRI is the only livestock organization within the CGIAR, and it's pretty much focused on how do we improve livestock production to benefit smallholder farmers? And this could be in relation to vaccines. This could be how do you improve the health of your animal, the genetics of the animal, the feed that you give your animal, looking at how livestock production utilizes the land and impacts on the land. You also have pastoral communities, as well as what we know as peri-urban or urban farming, but also, there's a link with policies and livelihoods, and how do we work with stakeholders and institutions, and also how do we scale up all of those interventions or innovations that may come from our research. We are a research organization, so we are deep rooted in understanding problems and how do we address those problems. ILRI has a presence in multiple countries. We are headquartered here by Kenya. In Kenya, we're co-hosted by the Kenyan government, but as well as the Ethiopian government. And it started, ILRI, as we know, ILRI now actually has its roots in the 70s, but then became ILRI when it amalgamated with the two different livestock institutions to form ILRI in the 1990s. And now we get into the topic that I truly love and have been working on for 20 years now. And I think I always start with this slide because I don't think we can afford to talk about resistance without understanding, firstly, that usage of these drugs are incredibly essential for our lives, and that modern antibiotics have been around for almost 95 years. And they've allowed us to increase our life expectancy. They've allowed us to intensify agricultural productions. So they are essential. And the mere thought of just removing it or reducing it has major impacts. By understanding or starting off by the point that these drugs are essential not only for our own health as humans, but those of our animals. And animals doesn't mean the food animals, it's also our companion animals. And we use antimicrobials also in crop production. And they're used in many different ways for therapeutic, prophylaxis, metaphylaxis, if you're a veterinarian, you know what that is, and growth promotion. Some of this is imprudent use, and others in other cases, use is necessary. But when we talk about use and when we talk about AMR, more and more I get the feeling that people don't understand the complexity. When you just look at antibiotic use on its own, it is incredibly complex. There are many different classes of antimicrobials, or even in this case, antibiotics, and each antibiotic acts differently. Its mode of action on a bacteria is also very different. Its spectrum of activity is very different. But when we talk about AMR, we talk about it as this entity where we lump all of this together. And I think that that is also wrong, because we don't give enough. There is nuances in this in terms of what is important and what is not important, what drug is relevant and what is not relevant, and who is it relevant for. So this is just in use that is complex. But then resistance is also complex, and there are many different mechanisms of resistance. And when we talk about AMR, we don't disaggregate between the drug, the bug, and the mechanism. We kind of lump it all together. And this is just different ways in which a bacteria can become or exhibit resistance to a particular antibiotic. But then if we add another layer of intrinsic resistance, this is bacterial species that are a group or a genus of bacteria that are intrinsically resistant to a particular antibiotic. For example, you would never use a vancomycin to treat a gram-negative because it's such a bulky molecule, it is not able to cross the outer membrane of gram-negatives. So gram-negatives are intrinsically resistant to vancomycin. But then you have another thing called cross-resistance, where resistant to one class of antibiotic confers resistance to multiple other classes. And then we have co-selection. So just when we talk about resistance in itself is complex. So if we add the complexity of antibiotics and the different types and its mode of action, and we add the complexity of resistance, it becomes a very, very challenging topic to really understand. But then we have to forget, what exactly is AMR? And I get the feeling that people don't really understand that, because essentially what AMR is genes. It's genes in a bacteria. And you can have an E. coli that is completely susceptible, and you can have an antibiotic-resistant E. coli. But a susceptible E. coli, completely susceptible E. coli, can be both a commensal and a pathogen. But an antibiotic and an antibiotic-resistant E. coli can be a commensal and a pathogen. So now we add another dimension of complexity when we bring the bug in, because a bug can be good or bad. And it really is dependent on the situation. And when we talk about AMR, we lose all of this complexity, which I think is incredibly important when we think about how do we control AMR. But this is not happening in isolation. If we look at a community, it can be any community. It could be ILRI's campus. It could be the village next door, Uthiru. It could be Nairobi. You have so many things happening. You have drugs going into the system. You have organisms in the system, resistant and susceptible or intermediately resistant. And it's all this stew of everything happening. And there are multiple drivers that would select for more resistance or select for more transmission from one compartment to the other. But it is this complexity in just a community. But really, it's happening everywhere. It's happening all around the world, and we are completely connected to each other. So that also means when we think about control, it's not just what is controlling in our little community or in our country, but how does this match with our neighbors, as well as how does it match across the continent? Because we are part of a global community. We share our food, we travel, we share a lot of migratory birds, they fly overhead. There are many different things. And so that makes AMR control a lot more challenging. And what I was asked to talk about is about the role of agriculture in AMR. We know that we use the same drug classes in humans, animals, and plants. Therefore, the resistance that develops either in animals, humans, or plants is something that will be, if transmitted to whatever bacteria becomes relevant for that sector, can cause resistance. Can cause, yes, treatment failure. But what is a really important concept is that resistance is a natural phenomenon. It is not something that we just created now. It is something that has existed since prehistoric time. If you look at ice cores from many, many years ago, you will find resistant organisms in those ice cores. So it is not something that is new. But what has happened in the last 100 years, in the last almost 95 years, is that with clinical use of antibiotics, we have now caused the mobilization of resistance into what is now clinically relevant resistance. And that's what I think is also another important, is clinical relevance. The AMR that we are really concerned about is the AMR that causes treatment failure, that causes people to die, or livestock to die, or it causes a decrease in production so we don't have enough food. So these are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about when we think about what interventions do we want? What is the outcome that we want from that? But as Daniel said, I take a very critical stance on this, and I'm happy to be challenged and happy to have a discussion. The narrative that is spoken is that antimicrobial use in the agriculture sector is the reason why we see so much problems in the human sector. And I want to say that I do not believe. We don't know a lot. This is a really nice paper trying to understand, well, how do we understand this attribution? And what do we need in order to understand and manage this attribution? For one, in our setting, we don't know how much antibiotics or antimicrobials we use in animals. More than that, we don't know what is the impact of this usage on resistance in animals. Already in the first part, we don't know what is the AMR burden in animals. The next part is that we don't know what is the impact of antimicrobial use in animals on humans. And this is resistance that is coming from the agricultural sector, not necessarily selected for or developed or emerged in the agricultural sector, but nonetheless a transmission of resistance. Remember that no community is free of resistance. It's there. It is being shared. Humans contaminate animals. Animals contaminate humans. They have a shared environment where they both contaminate and they both get resistance from it. But it's that sharing there between animals and humans specifically. When you look at it, there are different ways, there are different pathways where from animals to humans. We don't look at it the other way around. And what we don't know is when you look at resistance in human infections, what percentage of this can be attributed to animals, that it came from an animal. That E. coli that you are sick with came from an animal because of the food that you ate that came from that animal. We don't know that. And every meeting that I go to, I hear how much antibiotics we use in animals. And I've heard this term about 2/3 of the global consumption of antibiotics is in livestock production. And this is just based on the actual quantity of antibiotics that is given to a production system, which sounds quite a lot. But I think we need to be more nuanced than that. And we really need to understand, well, how much of that antibiotics are we treating? And this is what we look at when we look at this paper here looked at defining the biomass. What biomass of the earth do livestock consume? And as you can see, that livestock, which is right here at the bottom, makes up about 4% of the animal biomass. And humans make up 2.5% of the animal biomass. So livestock is much bigger in terms of biomass compared to humans. Therefore, it would make sense that you would use more because you have a bigger population to treat and bigger animals. You cannot compare treating a cow to treating a human if you just had to do a one-to-one in terms of the quantity of antibiotic you gave. So really what we should be talking about is not total figures. What we should be doing is something that is adjusted for the biomass. And that's what we do in humans. We adjust the amount of antibiotics we give per kilo of human. And we need to do the same. We need to take that amount and think about what is it per kilo of animal. And really, when you start doing those kind of balancing out, does the numbers really change? And this is data from the UK showing that you use more antibiotics in humans than you actually use in animals. And this is the same for many other European countries where it's more in humans than it is in animals. But nonetheless, in the last 7 years, we've had a major sort of focus on AMR, a global focus on it. And so a lot of countries have been able to, have been putting into place strategies to control AMR, developing national action plans, programs, research, various other initiatives. And every year, the tripartite or the quadripartite now sends out an evaluation where countries themselves have to rate how they're doing on various parameters. And when we look at how countries fare in terms of management of the animal sector, as well as a reduction in use and minimizing development of AMR, what we see is very, very little. Many countries are in the red or green. Red or amber. And really what we want is countries in the green. This means that you have a national action plan, but you are implementing that at the national level. And you are monitoring it periodically. And you can see on the African continent, not many countries are green. And I also think we need to be aware that this is a self-evaluation. So there is a certain level of bias in that. The other thing is that we need to think about when we talk about the usage of antibiotics in a livestock system is that we need to think about what is the livestock system that we're talking about, because not all livestock systems are the same. A system in Europe is not a system in Kenya. And even within Kenya, you have multiple different livestock systems. So this is a highly intensive poultry production system in the UK. This is a similar, highly intensive in the Kenyan context production system. They kind of look the same here. But this is also, we have these systems. These are pictures from Uganda, but I think it very much mimics what we also see here in Kenya. A farmer can have a couple of hundred birds, or they can have, just a few in their backyard. So which system? Because each system will have its own limitations, resource limitations and capacities. So in our context, which system should we be focusing on? Because the incentive for production is very different when you are this farmer versus that farmer versus that farmer. I like having this, looking at it in this way, because I think because we know that agriculture is an important part of national GDP in the low and middle income countries. And so we need to be mindful about how we address AMR, because we don't want to affect production. On the one side, agriculture is incredibly important for livelihoods. They are in a way seen as a savings, as a way, an income for people, but also as a savings for them if they need to pay children's school fees or any other sudden expenses. Animal source proteins are also very important for food and nutritional security. And it is also a business that favors gender and youth. But at the other side is that we need to produce more food because we are a growing population. But we have a climate crisis, we have a feed crisis, we have an energy crisis, we have a war going on in the Ukraine that is causing massive economic interruptions. But we also have people in low and middle income countries, or even here in Kenya, that have poor consumer power. Because a lot of the pulls that we also saw in Europe was that consumers had a demand for certain types of food. They did not want antibiotics in their foods. And therefore, they were willing to pay the double that was the case 20 years ago in order to have food that was free of antibiotics. And I wonder whether the average Kenyan would have the same money to demand for food that is free of something. But there needs to be a willingness to pay for that. And a lot of the times when I look at interventions is a lot about training. And I think training is important and awareness is important, but that's not enough. It needs to be coupled with incentives to change practice. So we need to have capacity building, but that capacity building has to be hinged on a change of practice. And I think the latter has not been done. The other thing is about regulation, and I'll show you a little bit in a few slides about what I think about regulation. And yes, while we do need regulation, because it's important to have good governance structures, but that's not enough. It's not enough to have the rules. You need to be also able to implement the rules. And the rules have to be, it needs to adapt to the realities on the ground when we think about who are affected by those rules. When we look at the agricultural sector, so this is data from the global AMR hub, and I just opened it before we started just to get what is the latest figures. So this is the total investments in R&D for AMR. And when we look at it stratified according to the different One Health sectors. So as you can see, there's been almost how much is that? Close to more than $500 million have been invested in AMR. But when we look closer as to where those investments have been, really most of it has been on the human side, and rightfully so, but really a very small part of that has been on the animal side. And last year, a very nice report was looking at this animal investment here to understand where was those investments being made. And really, the investments in animal health in low and middle income countries were quite minuscule compared to what is here. And when we look at, who funds, the majority of the funding in low and middle income country is currently coming from the Fleming Fund. And every meeting I go to, it's Fleming Fund. But Fleming Fund is highly concentrated in very few low and middle income countries. It's 23 countries. And how many countries are in low and middle income country? Is a low and middle income country? It's more than 20. What is also quite interesting from the report is most of this money here does not actually go to institutions in low and middle income countries. They are held by institutions in high income countries, and they then facilitate or implement the research in the low and middle income countries through partners. So they subcontract the work. As I said earlier, policy is incredibly important when we talk about AMR. And right now the focus has been about how do we reduce use? But when we talk about AMR and the control of AMR, it's not just about reducing use, it's about reducing transmission, because AMR already exists. So what we need to do is that we need to reduce the transmission from one sector to the other. And we need to reduce use. But the way to do that is by really having very strong policies. You need to have bans on certain drugs that can be used. You need to limit the profit of the prescriber. You should have penalties for high consumption. You need surveillance. You need education. You need treatment guidelines. And you need to have this incentive to use preventative medicine. And this is like vaccinations. And all of this here is very difficult in our conditions. And when we talk about how do you reduce transmission, which is another factor, it's about biosecurity. It's about decontamination strategies. It's about preventing contamination to begin with. And those are completely different set of interventions that one needs to look at. So I think it's important that we need to understand when we talk about interventions, what is the intervention that we're talking about? Is it about reduction of use? But you can't just reduce use. You also have to reduce transmission. And who has to do what? And what other resources do they have? And this has really been some of the bulk of the work that we've been doing in the last year or so, which I think for me has been quite revolutionary in the way that I think about AMR and I view it. When I came to Kenya, I had a very black and white view on AMR, what was policy, what you have to do, what you should do, and what needs to be done. And then met a completely different culture and a different resource limiting setting. And so one needed to be innovative when we think about that. But it's also to really understand about who is the actual person at the end that needs to implement the intervention that we're saying. Because I think a lot of the meetings we go to, it's mainly very high level intellectual people that are having this discussion. And ultimately at the end, it's a farmer who has to change their practice, and a practice that could negatively impact their family's economy. But at the same time, one thing is the farmer's economy, but there's also a drug stockist who sells these antimicrobials, but he or she too also has a family. And so what part of their sales is linked to the sale of drugs, and what proportion of this is then part of their profits. But a veterinarian also has to make a living, and all of these individuals have to make a living. And so it's really important to understand these motivators for the business, as well as the barriers to the adoption of what we call desired behavior. So who has the power? And I think that that's also another important concept. Because today I was in a meeting for a lot of East and Southern African countries, and in every country, somebody said they have a national action plan, and they were quite proud of that, and they should be proud of that. But really, when we talk about a policy, we have strategies, we have policies, we have legislation, and we have regulation. When we look at the global action plan or those of the UN organizations, these are strategies. It's just an action plan. There is no way you can penalize somebody for not implementing an action plan. You have regional strategies like the African Union, and here in Kenya, you do have a national action plan, but it's a strategy. And you also have counties have their own action plans, but again, it's still a strategy. What you need is a legislation or a regulation that allows you to implement that. And when we look at Kenya, and at the moment we're doing this, we're trying to see what policies are there and what legislation as in acts that support the policy. And the only policy in Kenya that we have that directly addresses AMR is the national policy on prevention and containment of AMR. So it's the national strategy that is then housed on a policy. But that policy, again, sets out a course of action. You then need the acts or the regulations in order to be able to implement the policy. And then too, there are not that many. They are in terms of the Veterinary Surgeons Act, the Meat Control Act, but they're not, if we look at how many bans there are, how do you limit the use of antimicrobials? They're very, very few. And also then becomes the implementation. So how much AMR do we have in Africa? I think in the video that I saw in the beginning, Anastasia was playing, it said about these numbers, the number of people that die in Africa, the number of people affected by AMR in Africa. And I think it's important that we are a little bit more critical of those numbers. So this is a report that came out very, very recently, and I think it's a really nice one. So I have somebody who's writing on my screen. Somebody called Phoebe. Thank you. You're drawing on the screen. I'm not sure how. So anyway, this is a really nice report. I suggest you go and read it because I think it tells us something about what we're using when we are generating these numbers. And they're really based on estimates and statistical modeling. So for the African continent, we have very few data points. And those data points sure looks like there's a lot of resistance because it's based on published data. But there is a nuance in that. And so we need to be careful about those numbers that we say, because we don't actually have proper figures for the continent. So how much AMR do we have in animals in Kenya? So I went onto something called Resistance Bank, which is supported by CDEP, and looked at for Kenya what it is. And according to Kenyan data, which is actually based on just 15 surveys that were done between 2004 and 2018, and this is pulling from the literature, it would say something like Kenya had in animals, in those animal isolates that were in that, it doesn't say anything about the representation, whether this is a number for Kenya. It's just that those 15 surveys, it's about less than 20% of resistance. And you can see here where Kenya would fare depending on the animal species. It's on the lower scale. I don't know what the resistance is because we don't have national data, nationally representative data. But from my own data, from my own projects, or from our projects, when we look at it, resistance is very low. This is again CDEP, and when you look at it in a global scale, when you look at Africa compared to Asia, and you can see the more dark it is, the more high levels of resistance. And so for us here in East Africa, resistance is not very high, and it's also taken from very few data points. And how much antibiotics do we use here in Africa? Actually, Africa uses some of the lowest quantities of antimicrobials compared to other regions. And this was a paper from 2020, and you can see the circles here. The highest use is in Asia, which also correlates when we look at where is the resistance in animal isolates, because the two go hand in hand. Use is a driver of resistance. If we're not using a lot, then we will not likely have a lot of resistance. And this one here is from the latest OIE or WUA report, which is based on import data. Again, you can see Africa, the amount of antibiotics that are imported into the country is fairly low when we compare ourselves to other countries. So I think it's important that we really understand. And when we go to meetings and we talk about AMR, and we talk about AMR in the livestock sector, and we talk about antimicrobial use in the livestock sector, I think it's important to think about what is that data that we're presenting and what does it really be based on. I'm not saying that we don't have a problem, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything. We need to understand that the drugs that we have in the veterinary side, they're the only drugs we have. There will be no new class of antibiotic to treat animals. So we need to consider and preserve what we have. So I think that that's really important that we remember those things. But at the same time, when we ask farmers about what it is that we want them to do, we need to understand that if we remove something, we need to give them something else. And what is the cost of that new thing that they have to take up? And more than that, do we want to cause a dip in production? Because a dip in production would be less food available. And what does that mean for nationally, if we reduce the amount of food available in the market? So I think for when we talk about AMR in LMICs, we are utilizing a scenario that is in a high income country or high income regions, and we are trying to extrapolate to ours. Whereas I think we don't know anything about the burden. And by burden, I mean how many humans are dying as a result of an AMR infection. And more than that, how many animals are dying as a result of AMR. We don't know anything about use, disaggregated use at the animal level or at the sales level, how much drugs are being sold. Import data is one thing, but we know that there are more drugs on the market because they come in illegally. So we need disaggregated data because we need to know where should our intervention, because money is not infinite. So we need to know, do we have to focus on dairy? Do we have to focus on chickens? Where? The other thing is about interventions at scale. I think one of the things is that we have not shown an intervention at scale. We don't know what is the cost of the implementation of the intervention, nor what is the benefit or the cost benefits of it. Whether it's feasible, access, distribution, uptake. What if you're promoting a new vaccine, what about access to this vaccine? Would a rural farmer be able to access it? And what is the cost of that? So it needs to be, because our farming systems are small scale, semi-intensive, and that intervention needs to be affordable for them. For those of you who saw my React talk a couple of months ago, I tried to do a comparison of what does it cost to treat and what does it cost to vaccinate. And then the reality is that a farmer, depending on how big the production system and how much money is in stake, because it's an investment, when you put that initial money to buy the chicks and feed and things like that, how much are they willing to lose by disease will determine what intervention they're doing. And I think there's a number of unintended consequences in terms of production and livelihoods that we don't really understand and may be quite detrimental in our context. So we need to be thinking about all of these things when we push the agenda for AMR control. What is really feasible? You cannot have a reduction if you do not have basic services in place, healthcare service as well as veterinary services. And you can't do it if you have improper sanitation and poor access to clean drinking water, as well as access to nutritious foods. You need all of that base. That is the basic that we have to build before we can start implementing and asking for bans and major changes in usage patterns. And that's the end of my talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Arshnee. It's always a pleasure. I really love your presentations because you put facts as they are and how things end. I think it's only if we address things critically, that's when we are able to come up with, real and feasible interventions. So I think at this juncture, I'll open the floor for questions. Maybe Anastasia, you can help us coordinate that kindly.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you very much, Dr. Arshnee. Probably let me first start with one question that I saw popping up during your presentation. So just a minute. Yes, there was someone who asked yes, someone who was asking for more. Okay, what is the meaning of AMU? This is from Bunny. Yeah. So
I see Karen has answered that. It's antimicrobial use, abbreviations.
Okay, so yes, you just kindly unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee. Please, can I be heard?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Man, I want to quickly ask during the course of the presentation, you explained that during the maybe the formation of our policy, we have to look into how the control of AMR, how will it affect those people that they directly earn from maybe selling drug or the use of drugs, such as farmers, those people that have drug shops and something like that. Now, can we have a policy that actually link all these issues and solve them once and for all? And my second question is that African countries mostly during the time of maybe when you are taking some statistical values on AMR, we should quietly be questioning some statistical values that we see based on maybe the drugs or the issue of AMR in Africa. I can quietly see not just on AMR or something, just maybe on some other disease also. Maybe we Africans have been maybe partially judged or something. Or I don't know, how can we bridge the gap on these kind of issues? Thank you so much, ma'am.
I'm sorry, Idris, I couldn't really hear. There was a lot of noise in the background when you were speaking, so I couldn't quite get the question. Can I ask you to type it in the chat box and then I'll answer it?
Okay, ma'am, I will do that.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry about that. I think the next hand was Mbula.
Yes, Mabule, maybe you can go ahead and ask your question, can you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you, Doctor, for the good presentation that you presented to us. I have a question, and my question is concerning with you have explained to us that sometimes this AMR can cause or may result into production loss or production decrease when you're cut or in an animal. So I would like to know, how do this AMR cause this production loss?
Okay. So the very first thing would be the most direct way in which resistance would cause a production loss would be that you are not able to treat the infection. And so the animal is then not able to produce because you will have reduced weight or you will have reduced milk production if it is a dairy cow. Also, the type of the product, be it milk or meat, would not be of the same quality because it is a sick animal. Because it has not been able to clear the infection. So that would be the direct link between AMR and production losses, is a reduction in the production or the animal simply dies.
Thank you for the good answer. I have understand.
Excellent.
I'm satisfied with the answer.
Okay. Maybe we can go to Jennifer. I think Jennifer, you had shared, you had raised your hand early in the session. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. I wanted to ask why you said that animals, initially before the adjustment of the figures, they had the highest number of resistance, and then after the adjustment, humans had the highest amount of resistance. So I wanted to know what could be the reason, maybe what other confounders.
Okay, so it's not about resistance, it's merely about use. And when we talk about use, when you go to a shop to buy antibiotics, when you look at the package, it has a concentration. And when you consume that concentration, that dose is how many milligrams of that particular drug per a kilo of human. And so that's how you're able to adjust, because you are not taking 1 kilo of drug at a time. You have to calculate how much of the drug you have consumed. And you can do that because it's based on standard dosage. So you can say, if a human, over a course of 5 days, if you follow the directions, taking it 3 times a day, you can calculate exactly how much of that antibiotic you have consumed. Similarly, we should be able to do for an animal, but it's very, very difficult to do that for an animal because an animal's, well, yes, you could do it by a kilo of animal because you do the same dosage pattern. And so typically when we look at how much we use, we don't adjust for the concentration or the biomass of that thing that we're treating. And animal biomass is much more than human biomass, or livestock biomass rather. So what we need to do is to make the two numbers comparable, because you can't talk about tons of drugs used in animals and tons of drugs used in humans and make a direct comparison. We need to adjust by the denominator, because we use more drugs in animals or in livestock because they're bigger and they're more animals than they are humans. And when you do the adjustment, that is how much drug per a kilo, then you'll see that we actually use more, because the amount of drugs that we use in humans and we adjust for the biomass of humans is a lot higher, the drug use, compared to animals. I hope that was clearer, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. Maybe we can go to Hakizmana. You can ask your question, then we read the one from Iradat. Idris, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation. We have seen that in Africa, as the number shows, the level of antimicrobial resistance in agriculture is high. So, and of course, it's having the impact in the human diseases. So I was wondering if the agriculture scientists are applying some kind of strategies just to combat antimicrobial resistance in agriculture. My second question is, can we conclude that this high level of antimicrobial resistance in Africa is due to the poor policies that are being set by the different authorities in Africa? Thank you.
Okay, when you say that there's high level of resistance in agriculture, what data do you have to support that it is high, and high relative to what? What percentage of E. coli is resistant to what? For me, high level resistance is something that is 80%, actually above 50, 60%, that's going to lead to treatment failure. Just because you took a commensal E. coli and you measured tetracycline resistance and 50% of those E. coli are resistant to tetracycline, what is the clinical value of tetracycline to whom? Because yes, for animals, 50% of resistance might be a problem, because if you're using tetracycline as a way to treat that. But if you're not using, if you have tetracycline resistant E. coli in humans, I don't really think that that's a very big problem. So when we say high level of resistance, what is high? 50, 60, 70, 80%? And then I would say, well, is the data truly representative to say that this is the data that is representative of the entire population of animals on the African continent? Because when we do studies, we typically go out and we sample 200 animals and we come back. How many chickens do you think there are in Kenya? 40 million? And if you did a sample size calculation on that, any sort of epi people here, if you did a sample size calculation and you assume 40% of resistance, in order, how many chickens would you have to sample to ensure that you get above 40, you get 40%? So I don't think our data is robust enough in order to make a decision on high level of resistance, because I don't think it's there. Similarly, on the human side, yes, I think resistance levels in some pathogens are very high, but there are also the pathogens in which that we publish that data. But if you had to sample 20 million Kenyans and we looked at resistance in them, the other thing is that typically when we look at human data, it's clinical isolates. They're coming from an infection. And therefore resistance tends to be higher in those compared to commensal isolates. So this is where I said something about commensal versus pathogen, which is, it's also related to surveillance, active versus passive surveillance, which is also related to treatment and treatment failure. If you are a healthy individual carrying a resistant organism around within you, which we probably all do, what is the risk of us dying from that? So I really think when we talk about AMR and if it's high or low, try to put a figure, a percentage of that next to it. It makes it easier to make a comparison. In terms of what does the agricultural sector do in order to address resistance, is that we are pushing a lot for prevention, disease control. How do we improve practices? Because I don't want to tell a farmer in order to change their practice, they need to reduce their use because of AMR happening on the human side. They will look at me like, lady, I have other problems going on. So I think what we need is, again, the foundation. What we need is animal or agricultural production to be based on good practices. And this is good animal husbandry, good preventive measures, the use of biosecurity, vaccinations, all of that. And that should lead to a natural decline. But farmers use antimicrobials as a cheap method of addressing a bigger problem. And it's incredibly complex if you sit with a farmer and really talk to them to try to understand and try to look at where their money goes and how much profit they make. Actually, a smallholder farmer, a couple of hundred birds, the profit margins are not very high. And now you're asking them, do you know what the cost of vaccination is or the cost of implementation of biosecurity? How much more profit do you think they would make from that? And it will not be seen in this production cycle or the next. We are talking interventions now that will be likely seen in a few years' time. And what we saw in Europe, when you remove the growth promoters, you saw a dip in production. What farmer will accept a dip in production? So those are the things that we need to think about when we're asking people to do something and the likelihood of the success of that. And this high-low, I think, again, we need to be mindful of the data we're using to categorize. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Arshnee. I think you have addressed also ILRI's question that they had asked. I think you've answered most of the questions that I can see in the chat box from the response that you've just given. Maybe we can take, because I see we are short of time. It's just 1 minute. Maybe we can just take one more question. Then I think we'll just check the others and see which one you have not addressed. And maybe I can share them via email then you can respond when you have something. Maybe Muhammad was the next. You can ask your question if it has not been answered yet from the responses shared. Hello, Muhammad, can you hear us?
Hello, good evening.
Good evening to you.
Yes, I think my question has been already been answered actually.
Okay, so maybe.
So can I just ask it?
If it has been answered, maybe we can give the chance to someone else, please. Maybe whose question hasn't been answered, if it's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, maybe who Iradat? Because you're short of time. Hello.
Okay.
Your network is breaking. Iradat, your network is breaking. Maybe you can type the question.
Hello, I'm audible. Hello.
Hello, can you hear us now? Your network
Yes, I can hear you now. I can hear you now. Am I audible now?
Yes, you're now audible. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my question is, in Africa, there are factors that might affect implementing and advocating for AMR. So putting this into consideration, how do we make sure that these factors are eliminated, especially in the production section, so as to make sure that people make good choices when it comes to antibiotics and also implementing policies that might help us in AMR?
Thank you. I think one of the things one needs to think about is what I was saying about incentives, is what is the incentive? And if we can show by good agricultural practice, that includes good quality feed that we put into the animals. A lot of the feed that we give animals are not very high quality, and therefore, how can we expect animals to grow and be strong? So that's one avenue, is to look at that. But we need to think about how much does that cost of this very nice feed and what is in terms of production. The other thing that we need to think about is how does a farmer earn its money, his or her money? It's based on the price. And what we know that farmers typically get the lower end. They don't get what we pay for the product in the shop is not the price that the farmers get. So how do we increase the farmers' value of their product? And that could be about, other looking at marketing and trade to ensure that you don't have to have middlemen, as many middlemen as possible. But really what I think is that what we need is a really good understanding of our system and how bad it is. And part of the work that we're doing now is to understand that animal health and the animal health impacts and what is the burden of disease in the different sectors. Because I think once we understand the underlying causes of the problems that farmers face, then we can address it. Because AMR is not necessarily one of those problems that they have. They may be facing a number of other issues. But just when we think of a tool like vaccination, who we all know is incredibly important and a vital tool in the fight for AMR. But if you look at the research or the issues in accessing a vaccine, cold chain, thermotolerant, and the cost of vaccination, those are all things that we also need to, which makes it very difficult to say, what is the one thing that we need to invest in? We need to invest in access to veterinary services. We need to invest in better quality feeds, access to vaccinations. We need to look at being able to make evidence-based training. Where is a diagnostic? How many farmers send a sample for diagnostics to verify what is the cause of the infection? And do we know what is the major pathogens that are relevant for a particular system? I think in some cases, farmers use antibiotics because they don't really know that actually what the problem is a viral infection or a parasite. So there are all these things that one really needs to understand the system before we can go in and start making the changes. Right now, we want to change the system without it really knowing. And I'm advocating for understanding what the problems are and addressing that first.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee. Maybe I can see 2 more hands. Do you have some time, or maybe we can send the questions to you?
I mean, I can stay on for another hour if you want.
Okay.
So I'm happy to.
It's okay. Yeah, so maybe Damilola, you can ask your question. Can go ahead. Doc has given us the leeway.
Hello, good evening, Doctor. Thank you so much for your presentation. Can you hear me?
A little bit.
Hello.
Yes, now it's better.
Okay. Thank you so much for the amazing section. It was really eye-opening and enlightening. But my question is, how do we combat the antibiotic drug abuse in livestock hearing? Because I could see your passion for the farmers, but how do we combat it in an economy like Africa, where, you know, Africans, things are hard and things are, a farmer can not want to let go of such practices because of the expenses. And my second question is there an alternative to using of antibiotics in livestock rearing? That's my question.
I mean, one of the things is that when we look at just the figures, using a little bit of antibiotics is really, really good at promoting the growth, which is why it was done for so many years. One of the ways that we need to firstly to remove this, because it is possible to grow animals without using subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics. This is not needed. But here in Kenya, I have an issue with the way these drugs are marketed, because they come in as a multivitamin. They are not registered as a compound that contains antibiotics, and they sold at 100 shillings, basically $1. And the farmers are told you should be giving these to your birds and you should do it on a daily basis. Now, when you are a farmer with not a lot of resources, and you can't afford to lose your birds and you want to sell them, you want to be able to sell them, you know, have good high weights in order to be able to get an extra money for them when you sell them. So growth promotion is not really used as a terminology in our farming settings. Actually, it's used as a immune booster or egg booster or multivitamin. So I think we need to, one of the ways to deal with that is, one, we shouldn't be importing these drugs, or we should be classifying them as an antibiotic and therefore treating them in a different way. Are there alternatives? Yes. But what is the cost of those alternatives? Typically probiotics, prebiotics, they cost a lot more because and we don't really know the efficacy of these other compounds and how it will fare in our systems. So that's what I mean by those kind of scalable interventions. They're not there, but you can't implement this without addressing the disease problem and that disease control. And that's where I think we need to look at first before we think about how then can we do these other changes. Because even though you may come in with a fancy probiotic feed, but if you don't have proper vaccination of your herd, or you're not having not having good biosecurity measures, then the value of that very expensive feed is not going to be there. So right now, I think in the systems that we have, we need to understand the problem and we need to address it in that context with the resources that those farmers have. And then we can build on how do we start removing these things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee. I think we'll invite you for another discussion. I can see it has really raised a lot of comments, suggestions here, and I think it's really eye-opening. Maybe we can take just the 3 remaining, the hands whose are raised, then I think we close it there. Ibrahim, over to you. Maybe you can ask your question if it hasn't been addressed by the responses offered so far.
Hello, thank you. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you can go ahead. We can hear you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Doctor. My question is that it has been observed that from most of the questions that you answered, you are hammering on like poor data, like there are not enough data. I just learned about a AI-based model that's if you have little data or little, like just little data, you can I think it like synthesize a large number of data from that little data. Then it was claimed that this data, synthetic data, can be used like in decision making or like in other like statistical modeling and all those things. They are more trusted than data that you're collecting over time. So my question is that how do you think this can be trusted in decision making, like that synthetic data? I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the models that we have, the problem with some of the models is that in every model you develop, there is an assumption. Because when you don't have data to put into the model when you design it, you have to make assumptions. And sometimes that assumptions can be good and sometimes they can be bad. And they then affect how the model, the results from the model. And the data that we put into the model, the one thing is constructing the model itself because it's based on assumptions. And it's the complexity of our lives cannot be simplified in a model. You cannot take a country like Kenya and model that because there are so many nuances that we cannot factor into the model. I don't think we have that ability yet. And even with AI based on limited amount of data, there are still assumptions. And and when you look at the numbers that come out, they're not absolute. There's a variance because you can't predict with accuracy what is good. The more data we feed into the model, the more robust that the model becomes. So in time, when we are getting more and more data being developed, but that data has to be good quality data. And I didn't even touch upon the quality of the data that we produce in labs here. I have a question about that. I think that as we do that, we'll be able to get a better picture of AMR. But right now, a model is only as good as the model in which the framework of the model and the assumptions that are based and the data that is fed in there. I think they're useful, but we have to realize it's a model, it's a simulation of a reality which doesn't capture all of it.
Thank you. I hope, Ibrahim, your question has been addressed. And I see we have the last one from Johnny. Johnny, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, good evening, Ma. Good evening, everyone. I have really been gotten quite a lot from the section today. The question I want to ask is to continue what Ibrahim asked. I want to ask about how do we go about the data gathering, since we discover that we can't trust some of the data that have been gotten. So how do we go about the data gathering so as to improve on what we have on ground? And then my second question is about as regards these antibiotics that you talked about, how do we also go about these policies? Because from what you taught us, we discovered that these policies will go a long way to help reduce the rate of antibiotics consumption. Because personally, I discovered from my own end, I have a friend that breeds a rabbit, and so me and him, we do that, but we do it on a local scale. And I discovered he himself, on a monthly basis, he gives his rabbit antibiotics. So personally, I wasn't too comfortable with that. So I said, no, I will not do that. It's until when you were explaining today that I got to understand the implications. So how do we go about these policies? Because if the government should just rise up and do some of these things, I don't think the local masses will so much have these policies implemented on their rearing of the rabbits and other farm livestock. So how do we go about that? That's my two questions. Don't know if it's clear.
Yes, so the first one about how do we improve data gathering? I think firstly, we need to understand what is the population that we're sampling, because already there inherently we put in biases, which makes it very difficult to compare the data. Another thing is about how we produce the data in the lab. And those two factors are incredibly crucial to understanding or to improve the quality of the data. We are all producing, we are all here that do research on AMR, we have data. We don't make that data accessible. Yes, we wait and we publish it in a nice journal, but there's a lot of data that is not published. And they're sitting in your master thesis or bachelor thesis in a university library somewhere, and it's not been published. So one of the things I would advocate for, every research has to have an ethics. And as part of that ethics, that data should be put in a repository so that the government would be able to firstly understand what research is going on, who's doing what where, and be able to have access to that data. They don't have to be able to publish the data, but they can have it for their own internal reports. So there's this issue, I think, that data is gathered, quality aside, but not accessible. When it comes to policy, a lot of if we had to look at trust, because in order to be able to have, for citizens of a country to abide by the rules of the country and uphold what is being implemented, you have to have trust in government. And I'm pretty sure if you look at the trust index for Africa in citizens in your governments, the trust is low because of many reasons why we know this is the case. So it's very, very difficult for the government to come up with very strong policies and implement them when there's low trust in the acceptance of policies. And if you look at countries where you do see acceptance of government, this is where you see rules becoming effective. So in general, we need to increase trust in government for the policies to be amendable to take up. The other thing is that when we look at the countries in which they have been able to implement policies to reduce use, if it was left up to farmers to do it, they wouldn't have done it. But they were forced to do it because it came as a regulation, a ban, and then there was a penalty if you did not follow that. That means that you have to have capacity to be able to do surveillance. And in Kenya, there is no capacity. Oh, in many low and middle income countries, or even on the African continent, it is very, very difficult to have the policy, to have people on the ground checking and following up, finding people, collecting money from people who do not follow the rules. It's simply not possible because you don't have that kind of resource. But that is what is needed in order to abide by the law. And so we really need to think about those systems when we come into place. The other thing is that in African countries, you have devolved governance. So the national action plan is a national action plan, but it's up to the counties to implement it, which then requires the counties to make their own county action plan. And that means the counties themselves have to dedicate money in order to be able to implement AMR strategies. It's not in the national government. So there are all these complexities in policies, different layers of governance and different responsibilities in order to be able to enact them. And it's those complexities and low trust that we need to think about. So I hope that was I was able to answer your question, Johnny or Samuel. I want to highlight something, Daniel, that you said in here about survival.
Sorry, Johnny, I think you're breaking. You can go ahead, Dr. Arshnee.
It's something you said about.
Yeah, I'm clear.
Excellent. Okay. So Daniel, you put something that says that resistant bacteria become the fittest and can survive harsh conditions. The reality is that bacteria don't want to be resistant. It is a biological cost. It is a fitness cost for bacteria to be resistant, because they have to acquire additional genetic material, be able to maintain that genetic material. And when they have to produce the resistance, they have to redirect ATP and other resources in order to produce it. So actually, resistance in many cases is not a fitness cost. It comes at a fitness cost. And typically susceptible bacteria tend to outcompete resistant in a population, because they survive better, their fitness is better. The only time where a resistant organism becomes the fitter one is if you have antibiotics in their environment And therefore, as the result of being resistant, then they have that added advantage. But resistance is actually seen as a stressor for bacteria when you look at their transcription profiles. So it's a misconception that bacteria want to keep it. No, if they could, and if you removed all the antibiotics, bacteria would readily give up their resistance because it's more plasmids, more genetic material that they have to keep. So it's a misconception.
Thank you so much for that elaboration too, and thank you for the correction. I've also learned about that. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Arshnee. I think all the questions have been addressed. You can see, Anderson, your question has been addressed by Florence, and it's good to also see that people also addressing some of the questions in the chat. So I'd like to hand over to Anastasia maybe, and then we can close the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Arshnee. I think that it's evident from the chat box and from the different questions that we have been getting today that your presentation really sparked something in the ambassadors. It brought out a lot of questions, a lot of theories, and generally we're really grateful that you were here. You were able to spare even extra time to answer some of these questions. I think that's it from me. I'm assuming, Johnny, this is the previous hand you had up. Okay, since there's no response in that regard, I'm probably back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, maybe, Dr. Arshnee, do you have some final comments as we wind up?
I just want to say thank you so much. It's lovely to see so many young people engaged and very much interested in a topic. I hope you find a career path that leads you somewhere exciting. And if it is within AMR, then I would be truly happy about that. I hope we cross paths at some point. I see some names that I recognize here, so that's kind of nice. Daniel, you're welcome to share my presentation to whoever would like to have it. It's good to, and I would always be available to answer questions. And I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee, for that. I think I shared with the team that you're very critical and practical, and I think now they can agree with me. And I love your presentations because they address what we assume, and I think that's what is ailing our continent because we just do things for the sake of without asking the questions that we need to ask. So thank you so much. And at this juncture, I'd like to say thank you to all the participants too for attending the session, and we really appreciate that you are here, and everyone else who managed to attend. Thank you so much, Dr. Arshnee, and I think maybe we'll have you back very soon to also share with us some more, and maybe this time on a specific area too. And we appreciate that you made the time despite it being very late here in Kenya, and we don't take it for granted. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. We'll share the recording and the presentations. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.